The NHS is a precious public asset. It is a quintessentially British public service. Let's not forget what the situation was like before the NHS was put into place. Those who can remember it will tell you what an extraordinary thing the NHS is and what it has done to their lives. It's not about supply and demand in that simplistic sense. Here we are dealing with people, with complex entities whose needs and aspirations are shifting from one second to the next according to the technological advances in our society as well. Not to have a public service that can take all that into account would be a big mistake. Public service is based on an altruistic principle of subordinating a narrow self-interest to a more expansive public interest. The quality of my life is determined by the quality of life of others in society. Public service values are therefore based on three fundamental principles. The first principle is what I call the principle of universality. That is to say that the public service should be available for everyone according to need and not according to the ability to pay, and regardless of social or cultural background. This means in practice equality of opportunity, equality of access, and most importantly, equality of outcome. The second principle of public service is the principle of fairness or equity. Services need to be adjusted or tailored to as far as possible to meet the special requirements of individuals and groups and communities. This means in practice understanding and respecting difference and providing culturally sensitive services wherever possible. The third and final principle for me for public service is the principle of accountability. Now, public services are paid for not by charitable organizations or through donations, but by the public through their taxes and their national insurance. So it seems to me perfectly right and proper for the public to monitor performance of the public service and to contributing to shaping the future of that service through active involvement with our civic institutions. Now, those are the three principles that determine for me a public service in the context of 21st century Britain. The debate between the public sector and private sector has, I think, been skewed. For instance, the private sector has accused the public sector of being inefficient and ineffective and wasting money. So not value for money, basically. I think that actually they do not understand the complexity of the public sector. They work in organizations which have very specific aims and objectives. They work to maximize the returns to the shareholders. They do not and are not concerned about citizenship, about what makes a society good to live in. That is not their concern. They are not concerned, for instance, in long-term goals. What they're thinking of is short-term gains, profits that will keep them ahead of the game. And of course, there are those who are addicted to free market principles and free market theories who are not inclined to be sympathetic to the idea of public service. Of course, markets try to understand ever more closely the needs and aspirations of consumers and potential consumers, but that is solely to try and maximize their sales and therefore their profit. Markets are not designed to deliver equality or justice or even truth or beauty. In fact, one could argue precisely the opposite, that unregulated markets can cause spectacular failures and deep divisions within society, rendering it even more fragmented and even more unequal. Democratically elected governments have to work hard to restore the imbalance created by unfettered market forces. This is where public services come to the rescue, to repair the damage caused by rampant competition, to replace narrow consumerism with a much more expansive notion of citizenship. There seem to be people who believe that the markets will deliver everything, that somehow or the other, people will find their own level and everybody will be happy. The playing fields, if you like, are already skewed in favor of those who have got power and against those whose voices are not heard. What people think about markets is that through competition, we can increase choice and we can increase quality. But actually, in real life, neither of those two things happen. Look at mid-staffs, for instance, where people got very concerned about getting foundation trust status so that it could therefore be in that part of the NHS where they could compete against other providers. They could borrow money and they could be an autonomous institution within the family of the NHS. We now learn that a drive to become autonomous, financially independent, had its costs. And the costs were in terms of dropping quality and dropping safety. The very people who were talking about market theories are now not talking about having a governance system that allows competition to be tempered by collaboration. I think that's good. I always said that the NHS should manage the market and not the market manage the NHS. And that is why I think that in open democratic societies, people must find a good balance between what I call the self-interest and what is in the public interest. The public service has not yet come back to set the record straight. There are many people in the public service that I know of personally who have dedicated their lives to giving the best they can in the service of others. Far, far more so than people in the private sector. Now, I'm not saying there are not people in the private sector who haven't done the same. Of course they have. But the people in the public sector haven't defended their corner to the extent that they should. I think we've got to really review our mechanisms by which we govern the private sector. Try to bring in some of the examples of good governance from the public into the private sector. To bring in some of the private sector workings around getting more value for money into the public sector. So I think there is something to be learned from either side. But people have to be open-minded about this. They can't simply hang on to their ideological preferences in the sense that everything public is bad or everything private is bad. They have to just begin to pick out the best, if you like, in the interests of the consumer, in the interests of the citizen. I think we've got to start thinking of people, not just simply as consumers, but also as citizens. Clearly, of course, everyone has a responsibility to be a good citizen, whether it's about litter on the streets or whether it's about law and order situations or protecting property or whatever it is. There are other kinds of public service that citizens simply cannot do or cannot get engaged in. Public service also requires a lot of dedicated time and effort and experience and knowledge and training so that the citizen can be best served. A willingness to clean up the streets is just not enough. It's not going to provide the kind of public service that makes for civil society. So we do need professional, if you like, public services to operate. But the ironic fact is that people who don't actually use public services, people who buy their own private services, for instance, education or health or whatever, are the ones who criticize the public services when they don't actually use them. Now, perhaps maybe if they start using the public services, maybe they will understand what ordinary people feel like when they use a public service that can be improved. Rather than get rid of the public service, let's improve them. Why not have all hospitals in a city providing good services? Yeah? Rather than having a kind of a battle between the weaker and the stronger, and the stronger wins and takes over and then creates a kind of a monopoly of services. I sometimes wonder, everybody wonders, well, what would it be like to have more money? And then you ask yourself the question, well, what if you did have more money? What if you did have all these millions that some other people do? What would you do with it? How would you feel happier? Yeah. And I sometimes have to say to myself, admit to myself that actually greater money, lots more money, would not necessarily make people happy. What might make them happier is perhaps when they're recognized by their society, by their peers, as having contributed something substantial to society, have taken society to a different place, have made a change, if you like, and to be remembered for it. Some of the greatest, most charismatic people in the world have never been rich people, but they have been people of conviction. They have managed to capture the hearts and minds of ordinary people a lot more than some of the billionaires living in our society, who will come and go like moths, will never be noticed, will never be recorded. Whereas some other people who have done public service might well remain in people's minds for a very long time to come. So who do you want to be?